Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be introducing some more advanced sound design techniques, and this video really follows on from last week's video, which was the fundamental sound design video. So do go check that one out if you haven't seen it. It lays a really good foundation to build on in this video. In the future, my sound design videos will be more focused on how to create a bass, plucks, pad, those sorts of videos, but this is a general video about some more advanced sound design techniques. All of the techniques are written in the description down below if you want to skip around the video or jump to the bit that's most interesting to you. But for now, let's just dive right in. The first topic we're going to look at is FM synthesis, which is frequency modulation synthesis. As with last time, I'm going to be using Sytnhs to demonstrate some of these sounds because it's really visual and I find that it helps a beginner understand what's going on. Starting with the basics, you'll know from the last video that this is our oscillator. This is what's going to be creating the sound. And with FM synthesis, we're going to refer to this as the carrier. So the next oscillator, I'll just turn it on here, but this time I've turned its level all the way down. So if I play it on its own, there's actually no sound going to be generated from this. This is going to be our modulator, and we're going to use this waveform to modulate our carrier signal. So I'm not going to go into the maths and how all that stuff works. I'm just going to look at the sounds and sort of give you an idea of what it actually sounds like, because I think that's more important when you're starting out. So on the first oscillator, there's this dial here. I can just right click and select FM from B, and then I can induce some FM synthesis. So if I just sort of hold a chord, and if you look down on the frequency analyzer, you can see that a whole load of harmonics are being added to that signal. And this will change depending on the waveform you use to modulate and also what pitch that waveform's at. So if I turn the pitch of this waveform down and then induce some modulation, so already we've got a sound that's just an awful lot more harmonically rich. I've got a keyboard down here, that's what I'm playing on, by the way. I like Sytnhs because it just kind of makes it easy to control the amount that you're using, so you can just dial it in until it sounds right to you. Until you've got something that you think might work for your song. And then of course, if you use this carefully with filters and with other effects, you can really get some usable sounds. Now let's look at some different wave shapes. So if I just sort of hold a chord and then change the modulator, you can see that depending on your carrier and modulator, you're going to get completely different results naturally. Let's see how we can use FM synthesis to make a bass sound a lot more interesting. So I start with this simple sort of sine pluck bass. You know, it's nice, plucky sine bass, but if I turn on oscillator B, level all the way down, this is just a slightly distorted sine wave, and then I start inducing some of this FM synthesis. We get a sound that just has an awful lot of more harmonic content in it, and it's really changed the character of the sound. We've also lost a lot of the low end, so I'm just going to add another sub to this. Just going to add a dash of reverb on it, and we've really made a very interesting bass here. We can just dial it until it's perfect. And I find that this is a particularly useful way to add a lot of character to a sound. What I find with FM synthesis is you might want to layer some sounds, like make a high bass, then a low bass, and combine them together so that you're not trying to make one synth do absolutely everything. However, if you like one synth to do just about everything, this is the plug-in version of an incredibly famous synthesizer called the Synclavier, and this is heavily based on FM synthesis, and there's all sorts of sounds you can create from this. You know, you've got all these sort of marimba and bell-like sounds. You can have some incredible sound effects, incredible pads. So this is one synth. This is just a plug-in version, but a very, very famous synth. Another incredibly famous synth is the Yamaha DX7. This is, again, just a plug-in version of it, but you can really get the most incredible pad sounds out of it. Just some really, really gorgeous, rich sounds. And, you know, FM synthesis is one of these sort of rabbit holes where you can just, there's just so much to it. And if you really want to have a lot of fun and, you know, spend many, many weeks, months or years figuring it all out, I would recommend it if you're that sort of person that's very curious about sound design. There's just so much to learn about FM. I find that although there's a lot of theory and maths behind how FM synthesis works, really you get to a point where you do it so much that it just becomes, intuitive. You know what sort of wave tables and wave shapes you're looking for, what you want as your modulator carrier, how to add, how and where to add your different effects to make it sound the way you want. So FM is really one of these things where it's going to take you time, but it really is fun if you want to dive in and try to figure it all out. It would, I could make an entire tutorial series just on FM synthesis. The next topic I'd like to look at in more detail are envelopes. So both for the volume, like the amplitude envelopes of a sound, but also the filter envelopes, and how these are quite important in defining the sort of punch and shape of your sound. So last time we looked at volume envelopes, and we also looked at an LFO controlling the filter. So what I would like to try and create now is a plucky sound. And I'm using a saw wave, so I've got quite a lot of high end in the sound naturally, and I've shaped the sound with my volume or amplitude envelope to be a pluck. It rises very sharply, cuts away quickly as well, and I end up with this. But although the volume envelope seems to be doing the right thing, even if I change it and make it even more plucky, I feel like I'm not getting any sort of thump or punch out of it, and there's just a lot of high end. So what you can do is, instead of using like an LFO to control the filter, like in the last video, you can actually use the same amplitude envelope or another amplitude envelope to control the filter cutoff. So let's just start without an envelope, and I'm just going to manually control the filter cutoff. So the sound becomes a little bit more bearable, but the transient's gone. We're not getting that thump or that actual pluck sound, even though my amplitude envelope seems perfect. So let's use this second envelope here, envelope 2. I'm just going to drag it onto that cutoff, and I've created a link. And now I'm just going to fine tune this cutoff and the envelope until we get more of a plucky sound. And just for more clarification, this envelope here is just controlling what this filter does. So when it's low, the filter's closed. When it goes to the top, the filter opens up, we get all the high frequencies, and then it cuts back down again. And that's what really gives us that pluck or that thump. It's a result of the filter moving very quickly through all the frequencies and then cutting back. It gives you like a sharp sort of punching effect. So we're getting an awful lot more of a plucky sound here. So now that I've adjusted both the amplitude envelope and an envelope to control the filter's cutoff, we get a sound that's a lot more punchy and plucky. But maybe I can fine tune this again and choose a different filter shape. That sounds a lot more like the kind of pluck I was looking for. And if I combine that with a track, that's a lot more professional sounding than the first sound, which was just too brassy and too full. And if you fine tune the filter, you can get even more out of this. So let's say that I change the resonance of the filter. You may be familiar with this. It just adds this little bump just above the cutoff or corner frequency here. So let's see what this does to the sound. Really changes it entirely into a completely different sound. What I'm also doing now is adjusting the drive of the filter, which can really saturate it and make it sound great. And just to reinforce this point about the filter adding that thump, if I go back to this bass patch, which I showed you a moment ago, which has a really nice pluck to it, if I turn the filter off, all of that pluck just goes away. We still have low end, but it's just not the same kind of thump in the sound. So the filter is really important. And what you find is that synths are often chosen or praised or loved due to or because of their filters. The filters on a Moog or a Moog synth just sound so good. There's something about the character, the resonance, the cutoff, the slope. It just imparts a character on the sound. And a filter is definitely not just a mathematical filter that's just doing a task. It really adds a spirit, a character to the sound. And it's worth diving through the filters to really find what you like. In Serum, there's loads. In most synths, there's plenty to choose from. The reason there's so many to choose from is because they all are subtly different, and having lots of different filters it helps you create a sound that is just exactly the way you want it to be. The next topic I'd like to look at is a closer look at LFOs. So I introduced this in the last video, but let's look into some different techniques here. So the LFO I showed you last time looked like this. It just raised and lowered, and we used it to control the filter. But I'm going to show you some different ways you can use LFOs to control things. So what I'm going to do first is just show you the sound, which is just a pad like this. It holds for as long as I hold the keys. And if I drag the LFO onto the volume here and then make a little adjustment, what you'll see is we get something like last time where the sound just goes up and down like this. But now if I choose a different LFO shape, so there's loads already built in here, or you can just select your own shapes here. For instance, this is a square wave where it's full volume, then cuts all the way down. What we can get is different effects like this, where you create sort of a stutter pad. When I'm not pressing the keys here, I'm holding it down with my pedal and it's doing the rest. So you can create sort of stuttering effects like this from within a synth. What I wanted to use this for was to show the different sort of triggering modes for LFOs. An LFO can be triggered every time that I press a key, or it can just be set to be on the whole time no matter which keys I press. It's sort of internally clocked to my DAW, so if I just hold the keys down, now it doesn't matter if I add new keys, they're all going to be stuttering on and off at the same time. However, if I turn it to a different mode like triggering and I press the keys at slightly different times, all of them are going to stutter on and off at different times. See how they're not turning on and off together? So there's lots of different sort of nuances and subtleties to LFOs that are important to consider, because sometimes if you want to have a sound just continually side chaining, but you're playing more than one note, if you don't hit them at the perfect time, it might stutter that LFO and really mess up your sound. So definitely dive into the settings and see what you've got available to you. In this LFO tool, for instance, if I hold a chord down, you've got smoothing. So if I turn that off, it clicks all the way to completely smooth. So this might just be a really good way to create a nice sound. The next thing I want to use the LFO to do is to subtly control the pan of a sound. You can link the two together, LFO and pan, and then change the area at which it operates over. So if I do this fully, this is just going to pan from left to right. It's going to sound really intense. But if I lower this area, it's just going to subtly pan from left to right. And if I lower the speed a bit, and it's added a huge amount of movement to the sound. So it's important to remember that the LFO might have sort of different boundaries on what it's controlling. It might not be turning something fully on and fully off. There might be more sort of subtlety to it in the synth that you're using. The next topic is how to move from one synth to another. So how to apply what you know on one synth to other synthesizers, because this one here is an emulation of the Prophet, and this quite frankly looks nothing like Serum. But there are so many similarities if you just sort of don't panic and just take each control one by one. Because when I started, I would shy away from synths that looked like this, and I would always go for Serum because this just is more modern. It just makes more sense to me at least. But there's a lot of people who this makes an awful lot more sense to. So I'm going to show you how to break something down simply. So this is a preset called Mild Brass that I've just loaded up right now. So we're going to try and figure out what's doing what, because there's no obvious wave tables. So what I'm going to do is just show you sort of how I would approach this and figure out what's doing what from sort of a beginner's perspective. Now if I press the keys, I'm listening for any other effects, so I can hear that there's a delay. So the first thing I'm going to do to simplify things is just turn off the delay. So look for anything that says delay or reverb. Let's just turn that off. So now we're left with a much more simple sound. The next thing I'd look for is some sort of master volume or a mixer, and also our oscillators, because we know that the sound has to start with those oscillators. So polymod, wheel mod, filters. Okay, we've got mixer, oscillator, and oscillator. So we've got A and B. So what I'm going to do is look at this mixer, and this is oscillator A, B, and then noise. So if I turn these all the way down, there's no sound at all. If I turn oscillator A up, we have one sound, oscillator B, another sound. So let's look at oscillator A. I'll just turn it up a bit. And we can see that we have frequency and some shapes. So if I just change the shapes, saw wave, a more sort of square wave sound, and that's simple. We're just sort of breaking it down bit by bit. Oscillator B. So this appears to be pretty much the same sound. It's a sawtooth wave. But on the frequency, on the fine tuning, it's actually been adjusted here. So I wonder why. Because if you push this too far, it sounds bad. Now, do you remember on Serum, if you have a sound, you can change the unison detune to make it sound wider. So this is likely what this here is doing. The fine tune makes it sound wider. So if I play oscillator A and B together, they sound pretty much the same. Now, if I push the fine tuning up, this will probably sound a lot more wide and lush. Wow. That changes the sound dramatically. Try different wave shapes. Not a huge difference, but a little bit. And now the next thing I'd look for are those envelopes, because that makes a huge difference to the sound. So I see a few here. I see cutoff resonance for a filter envelope. That's the filter. I'm looking for the amplitude or the volume envelope, which is amplifier here. So attack, decay, sustain, release. Let's increase the attack. Okay, release. So die away over a longer period. Quicker. Simple. So do you see how if you just sort of take it step by step, these sorts of synths aren't actually as intimidating as they might first seem. So don't be afraid of trying things like this, because this sound here, you know, it just right away it sounds good, and it just sounds very different to the way that Serum sounded. Serum was definitely a lot more digital. I had to do a lot more with the filters to really try and make it work. Having variety in sort of sounds and synthesizers, samples is so important to producers. There's not many producers you'd ever find who would say, yep, I only ever use one synth. That's the only thing I've ever used. I'm never going to use anything else. We love sort of collecting toys, even if they're just plugins. Once you sort of create one sound, maybe try to create it on another synthesizer. Or what I like to do as well is open up a preset that's complicated on one synthesizer, and then open up the same synth, so another patch, and then I just try to slowly match every single setting, and then I listen to it as I go and see what's changing. So this is something that I do in Serum. For instance, there's loads and loads of sounds in here. So if I just select any sound here, that's quite a nice plucky sort of bass sound, but it's extremely complicated. So now what I do is open up another patch of Serum beside it with a completely initialized patch, and I just start here, match these two, start at this oscillator, I'd match all the wave tables, and I just match it until it's exactly the same. But at each stage I'd be listening out to see what each dial does. This is, I mean, it's a long sort of tedious process, but it is enjoyable, and it's a way to really develop your sound design skills. The final topic that I wanted to go into more detail in is sort of effects and the order you use your effects and why this matters or why it doesn't matter. So I've got this sound here, which is just that pluck from earlier. So we've got that sort of pluck sound, and what I'm going to show you is just adding effects and the way this just dramatically changes the sound. Now, if I open up, say, a distortion plugin, and maybe I choose downsampling distortion, I could add a little bit like that and then mix it in. Completely change the sound again, really nice and subtle. Add some reverb. Often when you're using reverb with sound design, you've got to be careful to see if there's any sort of low cut on it. If you don't low cut it, the reverb's going to have a lot of sort of rumbling frequencies underneath, which might be okay, but it also might be pretty bad. Let's add a little subtle delay to this. I'm just going to use this EQ to sort of cut off some of the low and the high. And now it's important that you consider the order you use your effects in. So if I push the reverb on top of the delay, it's actually going to sound subtly different to having the reverb after the delay. So it's really important when you consider your effects that you don't just stop with the internal effects inside a synthesizer, because some of them don't have many effects, but that you also consider your mixer and don't be afraid to layer loads and loads of different effects on the end. You could be using anything. It doesn't really matter what it is when it comes to sound design. You just got to try and work towards that tone. I won't go into too much detail because I have a whole video linked here which sort of details which effects you should use in which order and why it is so important. But with sound design there are no rules. You can really try absolutely anything. And when it comes to effects, I tend to sort of listen to sounds that I like in songs from my favorite artists, and I just try to sort of match the sound as closely as I can. When you're sort of learning sound design, it really is a good idea to copy what the professionals are doing. And if you don't know, the name of something, ask people. If you've got a sound and you're not sure even what you might call it or how to name it, ask on YouTube, find a good Reddit server, a Discord server, join in the community, join in the conversation and ask people, because most of us people in the music industry, producers, beat makers, whatever, we're really happy to help people. We don't mind being asked a question. Like this style of distortion is called downsampling. It adds that sort of classic sound like that on top of it. For very many months when I was starting out, I didn't know that that was called downsampling or bit reduction. So I was going through these different distortion modes, assuming that distortion was just, you know, crunching a sound up. I didn't know that there was some sort of other sort of beautiful options in there as well. So don't be afraid to ask if you don't know the name of a sound or whatnots. So overall, don't be afraid to ask for help when it comes to sound design. Just join in with the community, join in the discussion. And, you know, it is a long process, so don't rush it and have fun with it. So I hope this video has been helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video too. Bye for now.